Hello and welcome to the dungeons. Dayman here. Today we're delving deep into our exosuit perks and our weapon perks. We will also be discussing the way elements apply to these, as well as going into a calculation as to better calculate your weapon's actual damage. So, let's get into it. Discussing first our exosuit perks. Here we have important notes to get into first. This is all based off of your damage per hit. That's right, damage per hit. The important notes will include that impale and pullback only affect your ranged weapons being bows and crossbows, not your side weapons. Criticals and power affect any melee hit, while might affects any thrown weapon. Pierce, it only triggers when your weapon sticks into an enemy. That's right, when it's stuck into an enemy, pierce will apply. Swords only stab into fleshy enemies such as zombies and imps, but this is not talking about weapon perk stab. This is instead talking about the physics engine of a bladed weapon binding into an enemy. Pierce is very different from weapon perk stab damage, so keep that in mind. We are talking about exos, not weapon perks this time. Let's get into it. Impale offers 200% damage 40% of the time, when it is fully maxed out, mind you. This additional damage, or ADD, this is the number that you will plug into our calculations for later, so keep that in mind. The method by which these things apply are when they are shot, and the weapons that it is applied to are bows and crossbows. Now, here when we talk about our tiers, it's based off of the damage per hit, So, just because an exo perk is useful, does not mean that it is always going to be a tier 1. It's talking about the most damage applied. Pullback. Once again, this is working for your bows and crossbows at ranged. This offers a 50% damage increase 100% of the time. That means that 50% damage increase is always on your weapon, no matter how you're using it. Granted, you're using it correctly. And that'll, for your calculations, that'll be 0.5. The method by which it's applied is when it's shot. However, this is a tier 2. As though it is still very good, it is not better than crits, which ranged crits are called impale. For melee crits, yeah baby, this is where Dayman shines. Criticals offer a times 3 damage output. Though it says here 200%, it is actually, the way the damage is applied is times 3. And that times 3 damage is 40% of the time when the exosuit is fully maxed out. For 0.8 additional damage. 1.8 additional damage. The method is in any melee weapon, such as axe, blunts, daggers, great swords, spears, and swords. Now, mind you that you can throw a weapon as long as it's a melee model, and that critical can still apply. And that is why this is a tier 1 perk. You're going to get the most out of it with many weapons. Now, dropping into the tier 2, we're going to look at power. 100% of the time, you're going to be dealing 50% more damage, and that equates to 0.5. Still very good. And this again applies to your melee weapons, but because it's competing with criticals, it just doesn't get there, baby. However, for damage consistency, it's very good. When we look at Pierce, now this is where we start to get into something a little more finicky. Our first tier 3 perk, which means it's at the bottom of the rungs here. Not the best, the worst. Pierce offers 100% more damage 100% of the time. That sounds amazing, but this is where we get into the caveats. Though it offers 1.0 damage, it must be stuck into an enemy. So even though it says it's 100% of the time, that is only 100% of the time that it's stuck into an enemy, meaning that it will not always be on. So, your regular weapons, only when bound into an enemy and therefore not active in the fight, not actively dealing damage, that is when it gets triggered. And this is for axes, daggers, greatswords, swords, and spears. I find that it's a bit easier to trigger with axes as well as spears, but the dagger also gets pretty bound up at times. Going into Might. I love Might, and it is a tier 1 perk to be sure, as it affects all your thrown weapons, being your axes, your blunted weapons, including cudgels and hammers, your daggers, your spears, and some throwable swords. So, the caveat there for swords is that they are thrown. The damage output is 100% additional damage, with a 100% always on, assuming you're throwing the weapon. The additional damage calculated is 1.0, and the method by which it applies is when it is thrown. Moving on. Weapon perks, yes. These are our weapon perks. And these again based off damage per hit. Now, we're starting off with Dayman's favorite. That's going to be our critical. The critical weapon perk is 300% more damage, 32% of the time. It triggers slightly less often than EXO perks, but it actually stacks. Its chances stacks. They are rolled separately, but applied simultaneously. That is also true for the damage, meaning you're going to be dealing even more damage with your critical hits, and that's why this is an A tier. Heck, I'd give it an S tier if I'm being honest. Now, we do have a note from Brumps, the developer, who claims that the way in which damage calculation is done so more accurately would be... Make sure I'm getting this information right for you. Oh, yeah. So, for weapon perk crits, it's 1.64. So, that 0.196, though would still be a fairly accurate way of calculating your damage, Brumps claims it is for weapon perks, 1.64 for that additional damage calculation. And again, this is a tier 1. And criticals will work for all of your melee weapons, regardless of how they're being used. Here we come into our area damage, 200% damage, meaning it's a times 2 damage modifier, while also applying a radial damage. So not just the target you're hitting, but the targets around that target will be struck. Now, this is for only your blunted weapons, but the times by which it's being triggered is only 32% of the time. You might be curious, how do you calculate that percentage chance? This is assuming that you are a maxed level character, and at level 60, perhaps a touch sooner, but you unlock Loot Tier 7. If you're curious about your loot tier, go into a dungeon, and as it loads, look at that menu, and you will see along all the details screen, it'll tell you what your loot tier is. Loot tier 7 means that you will be applying the highest percentage chance along all weapons. At the lower tiers, it typically goes about 5% for each tier. Now, that's not entirely true, I think, for some of the chance, like criticals and area damage, but you can't quote me on the actual damage, on the actual percentage increase there. But this is the additional damage, 0.64 for area damage. This is a B-tiered perk because despite it being quite useful, it just doesn't output more damage than criticals, even though it is a phenomenal perk. Very similar to area damage is explosions. Now, explosions work for spears and axes, unlike area damage's blunted weapons like hammers and cudgels. However, with this Halloween update, we just got a brand new weapon, those being the sickles. And the sickles are a slightly longer version of the axe as a retextured model. I hope they stick around past November 10th. If they don't and you watch this later, forgive this information. But if you're curious about those sickles, they are your axes, granting ×2 damage within a radius as well, 32% of the time. Alright, another B tier ranking, and here we're going to have ratings and tiers being slightly different at times, simply because that even though something does good damage, it might not be the recommendation over others, as we have stab damage. Now, stab damage used to be bugged, but now it's just a feature, baby. So, stab damage does 50% more damage 100% of the time. And mind you, you do not need to thrust a weapon. That weapon damage will be available on any way that you throw that sword, even if you throw it. And that's one of our important notes down there, which we'll get to now. So even if you throw that stab weapon sword, it will still get that 50% increase. Alright. And that damage calculation is 0.50. And the rating there is a C. The rating there is a B with a ranking of 2. And this is available on both sword models, long and regular swords. Getting into our attack power. This is where we start to see a disparity between rankings and tiers. Attack power is very useful at 35% additional damage 100% of the time, meaning attack power is always on. For your additional damage calculations, it's 0.35. Now, it's a rating of C while still being a tier 2, meaning even though its damage rating is slightly lower, it's still a rank 2 or a tier 2 perk, as it is very good. Mind you, attack power is going to affect your melee weapons. Getting into throw damage. Throw damage is only available on weapons such as the axe and I believe the spear. Throw damage does 35% more damage 100% of the time that you're throwing the weapon. Now, because it's not available on all weapons and its damage output is not phenomenal, unless paired with other things, it's a D tier, our first D tier rating, and our first D tier 3 tier. Alright, critter damage. Yuck. Here we're going to start talking about creature damage, and all creature damage is F tier. However, there are few caveats where I might give it a D-. So let's get into it. Critter damage. It's the worst. Critters have the lowest the lowest health threshold of any enemy types, meaning additional damage on them is almost irrelevant. Mind you, the giant scorpion boss is not a critter. It's a monster. So there we actually have even fewer creatures affected by critter damage, which all of these deal 35% more damage 100% of the time. Now, elite damage. Elite damage is one of those D- perks. When you're pairing this with attack power or stab or criticals, maybe then you're going to get some use out of it. Elite damage are your red enemies. However, mind you, that the purple boss type enemies are not elite. They are legendary. So, we're going to get into monster damage. Monster damage is still an F tier, but monsters affect more boss type enemies, as we have the Octoculus, the Doomer, and the giant scorpion, and I'm assuming the golem as well. So monster damage is pretty good against bosses. Sorcerer damage is even worse than critter damage, simply because there are only 2 sorcerers in the game, the standard skeletal mage and the uber mage. It just ain't worth your time, baby. Now, undead damage. This might actually be a proper D tiered, because undead creatures are available in all biomes and are the most common spawns. So if you have an undead creature damage perk, hey, I won't fault you for it. Not to mention, it's going to affect the most difficult boss in the game, some people believe, being the skeletal boss. Now, getting into your max damage per hit. This is looking at your weapons and your exos, okay? So, at the very top of your exos, for your ranged options, for bows and crossbows, you want your impale, okay? For your swords and your melee weapons, such as your greatsword and sword, you want to have criticals as your exo perk. For axes, the best exo perks are might and critical. That is also true for your blunted weapons. Now, the thing about blunted weapons as they pertain to might, blunted weapons do not have that sticking effect that we discussed before. Though they don't stick into an enemy, that means that they can return to your hand, increasing your DPS, baby. Alright, moving into our dagger exos. The might and criticals is another great option. Now, with the spears, I think the best for them are both might and criticals, but to be honest, it's actually criticals, because the highest damage potential in the game comes from the spear. When you have the exo critical paired with the weapon critical, and the weapon perks being explosion with the elemental fire for additional times 2, oh yeah. Alright, let's talk about weapon perks. For your bows, the first weapon perk you might consider for bows are criticals, and the second being attack power. However, a very useful perk is slow. Getting into our crossbow, here we have the first weapon perk being critical, and an essential for this weapon is reload. Now, you can get some utility out of slowing, but when we get into the daggers, your first weapon perk is, this is again, talking about the maximum damage per hit, not the most utility. I had a former video talking about utility with your weapon perks, so this is just talking about all you damage goblins out there who want to be getting kills. First weapon perk, critical for dagger. Second weapon perk, attack power. Now, somewhat useful. Now, this is where I'm going to disagree with the spreadsheet. A useful for max damage is going to be fire on your daggers. But poison provides utility, and it offers damage over time, though the damage is quite minimal. If it equates to player poison damage, then we might be able to assume it's 25% of a creature's overall health, but that has not been confirmed. Here we go into our blunted weapons, hammers and cudgels. The first weapon perk is criticals, and the second is area damage. A useful perk on your blunted weapons is, again, slowing. But slowing will take priority over area damage. So if you're running area damage, don't run slowing on your blunted weapons, as it will reduce your maximum damage. Keep in mind, I also recommend fire to get even more out of those blunted weapons with area damage, and that's true for our explosions. Daveman already did a brief rant about the spears with criticals and explosions for our first and second weapon perks. That's also true for our axes. Criticals and explosion axes are phenomenal, but its damage cap is slightly lower than the spear. Let's get into our great sword. For your first weapon perk, I would recommend criticals, and for that second, it's always gotta be stab. Some people feel that unblockable is essential, as it will get past damage resistance, and when we're talking about max damage per hit, anything that's getting past resisted damage is useful. Now, I actually disagree that knockback is useful, and I think it's almost a disgusting waste of time. But that's just that's a Dayman rant, and forgive me for it. Use it if you want. It is loads of fun. I actually have fun with knockback, but that's all. When we're getting into our side sword, we have criticals and stab once again. Oh yeah. Now, when we look at our damage per hit formula, this is assuming your average damage, hit is one hit. So you can. This is not looking at as many hits as you can get off in a certain amount of time. This is only looking at one hit. So within the first parentheses, we acknowledge that first hit. That's what that one is. That's your first hit, and it is added to first your EXO's additional damage. Okay, then you need to calculate your weapon, your first weapon perk's additional damage. Calculate your second weapon perk's additional damage. You add those together, and you multiply all of those to your weapon's damage. Okay, now. Here we have an example of the Pimp Spear, and this is where we get into the shout out of the day. Pimp Nokia, an absolute baller out there. His knowledge of this game is paramount. It exceeds Dayman's, and I would not be here without Pimp. I love you, homie. We were hitting a dungeon yesterday, and we were talking about how we need to get into the nitty gritty. We need to figure out exactly how this game works. It's where we derive our fun. Now, he has what he calls the Pimp Spear. His Pimp Spear is his mythical spear with criticals and explosions, and he's using the Might perk. Now, I would recommend using the critical perk, but to each their own. Now, when he puts in his spear damage at 173, assuming one hit, he's looking at his criticals, his EXO, which is his might, his which is 100% damage, his criticals, which is 300% damage, and his explosions, which is 200% damage. He's calculating his 173, assuming all the stars align and his weapon perks and exo perks trigger. He's dealing 1,211 damage. Can you believe it? Oh, yeah. Absolute phenomenal damage. Now, here we also have a note. I've already discussed it, but fire does the same amount of damage as explosions. Now, his particular, you would also be adding the fire your elemental damage, which would only really be applying fire, which is ×2. So if you do use fire, you can add your explosions additional damage percentage. Now, let's get into the elemental analysis. And again, we're looking at damage. Okay, the additional damage for your elements is 0.68 for 200% damage per hit. And that'll work for any weapon. Ice and poison, okay? Ice and poison do not affect their respective enemy types, but fire's a bit different. Fire actually damages fire type enemies, and will be the most effective damage against bosses. However, poison does affect bosses, and ice doesn't. Ice has this reputation of being this one-hit wonder boy, but I've kind of moved on from ice, and I frankly enjoy my fire. Enjoy ice if you do enjoy ice, but just know that you're not getting the most out of it, unless it's an 8-shot crossbow, and then hey baby, yeah, rock it. Now, the knockdown of fire and the freezing time, as well as the pseudo sleep effect of poison, all have the same recovery time. Okay, they seem to be affected for about almost 10 seconds. Okay, now when it comes to quad damage will not affect ice, nor will it affect damage over time from poison. but quad damage is a part of the overall damage calculation, meaning fire and quad are a great combination. Now, Pipnocchio is a big fan of Borderlands, and I find this quote hilarious. To paraphrase Borderlands, if you had to hit him more than once, you weren't using fire. Alright. Now that you know exactly how to calculate your damage, make sure you wash your face and disinfect that face mask, baby. Until next time, Dayman out. Peace.